Hey, Eric, I'm excited about this one.
I'm excited you made it back from abroad, alive and well.
Yes, I was abroad, and by that I mean I was abroad. I had a great time. That's
a future episode.
that is a very future episode. That's right. So, listen. So today we're going to be talking about. So, I used to teach Sunday school when I was, however long ago.
Younger than you are now.
Younger than I am now. And I used to specifically teach the gospel principles class.
Oh,
right?
okay, sure.
Yeah. And one of my favorite lessons that we used to talk was about agency, which is kind of our topic today, but we're talking generally about determinism and how it relates to the church.
In other words, instead of using the word that the church likes to use, you're using the word that means the exact opposite.
Agency versus determinism.
So you're the controversial one in this episode. Got it.
Let's start with agency. Okay. So go ahead and give me the Sunday school definition for agency.
Agency means that I have the capacity to mold my own fate, to make decisions, and accept the life that is the consequence of those decisions.
That's right. That's exactly right. You can mold your decisions, right? So you can. So the reason I bring up the Sunday school lesson was because it has my favorite quote about this topic. And for me, it always explained the difference between agency, right, which is the thing that people understand, right? But people always conflate the word agency with the word freedom, right? Which is not the same thing.
Just looking, before you arrived, I was in the library of our ward building, and I was looking through old quote books from the 60s and 70s, and I was looking under agency, and nothing was there, and it eventually occurred to me to look at freedom.
Yeah.
And it was sometimes freedom and free agency, but often it was just freedom. Agency didn't show up in those books.
It didn't show up in those books, in the old church books. Oh, that's interesting. Well, in the Sunday school lesson, right, the Gospel Principles Manual, the title is Freedom to Choose. So it uses the word freedom in the title.
Okay.
So here's the quote, right?
Is this from the Gospel Principles book?
This is from the Gospel Principles.
Check.
And do you know anything about the Gospel Principles book?
Sure.
As a whole? Like, who wrote it?
A committee.
A committee.
Of correlators.
A committee of correlators.
Yes.
What does that mean?
That means, so the church takes seriously this little cliche we like to say about how the church is the same everywhere you go.
Yeah.
But the church takes that very seriously, and since the late 60s and really picking up steam in the late 70s, we've worked hard to make sure that no matter where you go, you hear the same thing and you're taught the same thing. The Gospel Principles book is sort of the core manual for getting the basics out there. When you become a member, until you feel comfortable moving up to the other Sunday school, Gospel Principles was the class you went to, and you went over the basics till you felt
it was my favorite thing to teach. It was 22 episodes. It was a full season of content, right? 22 chapters.
Yes.
And it was super fun to teach because it was all the basics, right? I really got into it. When we follow the temptations of Satan, goes the quote, we limit our choices. The following example suggests how this works. Imagine seeing a sign on the seashore that reads danger, M dash.
Danger M dash?
Well, I'm just trying to read the dash. Like,
got it.
You're all fancy with your English
I'm
stuff.
I'm not looking at it. I'm just listening.
Every now and then Okay. Danger, whirlpool. No swimming allowed here.
Oh, M dash. Like in the longer dash.
The longer dash.
I thought it was danger M and then a dash. No. I thought they were like censoring the word M, and I was really confused.
I was trying to be Englishy. Right.
Sorry, you succeeded. You just outperformed me.
No swimming allowed here. So here's the sign. You can't go swimming.
It's dangerous.
Right?
Got it. I have a feeling where this is going.
We might think that it is a restriction, but is it? We still have many choices. We are free to swim somewhere else.
You bet.
We are free to walk along the beach and pick up seashells. We are free to watch the sunset. Right? We are free to record our podcast, even though above us the buffalo of children are stomping around.
The buffalo have just shown up.
Right? We are free to go home. We are also free to ignore the sign and swim in the dangerous place. But once the whirlpool has us in its grasp and we are pulled under, we have very few choices. We can try to escape, we can call for help, or we may drown.
And to add to that, if you have not studied how to swim in a whirlpool, you probably have even fewer options.
That's right. I've always loved this idea, right? Because it so incredibly well describes the difference between freedom and agency, right? And captivity.
Okay.
Right? Because your agency is the ability to choose. Freedom and captivity are the results of those
Okay.
choices.
I see what you're saying. Yes. So freedom and captivity are two possible consequences of choices made.
That's right.
Check.
So anyway, I always like that particular analogy. So, so I thought we'd start here. This is the Sunday school definition of the word agency: the ability to choose. What gives us the ability to choose?
I think I would like you to clarify that question, because I feel like no matter what I say, you're going to say gotcha afterwards.
I actually didn't have a gotcha prepared.
Oh, okay.
I'm just curious. Where do you think there's two different? We could talk about the religious
Okay, yeah.
derivation first.
Sure. So there's the religious idea. It comes from our spirit, our, the fact that we are children of the divine, right? So that's a source of agency. It's a little more complicated on the science end, which I think is your attraction to this topic.
Yes.
So I have no doubt we will get to that.
Uh-huh.
But I do think it's worth pointing out that as Latter-day Saints, our religion is really dedicated to this idea of agency. I remember learning about Calvinism in high school English in preparation to read Jonathan Edwards.
Yes.
And then later, The Scarlet Letter. And my high school English understanding of Calvinism, which is accurate enough for the purposes of us right now, I think, is that God has already decided whether you're going to heaven or going to hell.
Right.
And the only reason to live a good life is to convince yourself that you're a good person, right? I mean, that's a little unfair to Calvinism, but that's kind of it, right? Like, why, if we've already decided whether we're going to heaven or hell, what's the point of trying to be good? Well, we're not really trying, we're just proving that we are what God already knows, or, something. It's this complicated idea where, do we have choice or not? Like, if God has already made the decisions, and the world has already set out the way it's going to be, then do our actions have meaning?
We believe specifically that the atonement bought our agency.
Okay? I think that's a fair statement.
Right? We believe that through Christ, that is why we can choose, right? Is because we have the ability to now choose good or choose evil and live with the consequences throughout our life.
Yes.
Right? And as you said, this is a huge deal for us in our church, right? To the point where it goes deep on how we administer welfare, right? Because we believe that you need to get off welfare, right?
Right.
So we want to work with you and help you use your agency to better your life, right? But if you work hard and you make good choices, you should be able to accomplish your goals, right? There's this fundamental belief.
You just made me really uncomfortable.
Uh-huh.
Because you might work really hard, but the fact is, the reason you got on welfare in the first place is because you broke your back running in front of a bus chasing a small child.
I'm not saying this is guaranteed.
Right.
But this is
we got to be careful not to fall into the prosperity gospel. And like,
I specifically
you have money because you're good.
Teach my children that in order to succeed in life, you need three things, right? You need hard work, you need connections, and you need luck.
Yeah. Speaking as someone who writes, you can't overstate the importance of luck.
And all three of those things are incredibly important. We mitigate the effect of luck by through trying through the other two, and through hopefully our other things and our studies and whatever.
But it's certainly possible to be successful by a certain standard entirely through connections.
Yeah. Just
because of who you were born to.
That's right.
Like, one of the Coke kids makes really grotesquely ugly Hawaiian shirts.
Yeah.
And he's very rich, but it's not because he's good at what he does.
Yeah.
He's terrible.
I mean, one of the makers of Coca-Cola.
No, Coke, like the big donors to the Republican Party.
Oh, okay, I gotcha.
Those Cokes, or KOCH, not. I don't think there are any Cocas. Like, I don't think the Coca-Cola was named after anybody. It was just named after a plant.
After cocaine.
But I really like the idea that there's like some Koch brothers who own the Coca-Cola mafia.
I guess I always thought they were the Koch brothers.
Oh, is it Cock? I always thought it was Coke.
Or Koch.
Cock is very funny. I think if it was Cock, I would have heard that many times by now.
I always read it in my head.
That's hilarious.
Okay, so it's interesting that analysis of life, right? You need those three things. Actually diminishes a bit the value of agency, right? And it's a bit more of a realistic, or maybe you could even say pessimistic view of life.
I don't know. I mean, if if everything had to be equal for the plan of salvation to work properly, then we would all be born in identical circumstances. And given the state the world is in, it seems clear to me that that must not be true.
Yeah.
So
In fact, that was one of the parables. We've mentioned that parable before. You get 10 talents, you get 5.
Yeah.
You get 2. What can you do with what you have is the question. Not let's try to make everything equal, right?
Right.
Okay, so agency, from a religious perspective, I think that's fine, all right? But what's interesting to me is the neurobiological perspective. So before we go there, do you have any other topics you want to
Religious-wise?
Yeah, to jump in on. I mean, we're going to come back to philosophy.
Do you want to hear my pitch that the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible is an anti-determinist text?
Okay, sure. Yeah, that sounds interesting.
All right.
First to tell us about determinism, maybe.
Okay, so determinism is the idea that basically all of everything, including what you and I put on this morning, is entirely determined by Newtonian physics, essentially. And I mean, that's not exactly true, but for purposes of, think about Newton, if everything that, there's an equal and opposite reaction and so forth, everything is very predictable. If you know all the elements, you can do the math, you know exactly what's going to happen.
Right. So
the idea is that if you had a sufficiently complex algebra, and by the way, that phrasing is stolen from Arcadia by Tom Stoppard, which we talked about last month. If you have sufficiently complex algebra, you could figure out everything. You could start at the Big Bang and work all the way to the Kardashians, and it would be inevitable. It would be the only possible outcome.
Right. So it completely ignores chaos theory.
Right. Yeah. Ian Malcolm is dead to these people, and I'm not okay with that because he's one of my favorite characters. But you know what? The Big Bang required me to feel that way, so I don't know why I should be bitter.
That was a Jurassic Park reference, by the way.
And if you don't get it,
you need to go and watch it 6 times in the theater when you were a teenager.
That's right. Oh my gosh, have you been spying on me that long?
Yeah.
Yes, that. I think it was 5, but your point is accurate. Yeah.
All right, hit it.
All right. Okay, so I'm going to Joseph Smith translation. Joseph Smith took the King James Bible, made slight alterations to bring it more in line with the Word of God as he understood it.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, how the translation worked is probably a completely another episode, and I'm sure the Maxwell Institute has covered it. You can go look them up. So this is one change that he makes many times in the Old Testament. I'm going to read the example from Exodus 10, verse 1. But this kind of change Joseph Smith made a lot of times in the Bible. So here's the King James Version. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go in unto Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart, and the heart of his servants, that I might shew these my signs before him. That's the original. Joseph Smith translation. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go in unto Pharaoh, for he hath hardened his heart, and the hearts of his servants. Therefore I will show these my signs before him.
Okay.
Sorry, the buffalo. So, in the original, God hardens Pharaoh's heart in order to make him reject the Israelites so he can destroy them in the Red Sea. And basically God is micromanaging the entire Exodus.
Yeah.
Making sure that the Pharaoh does exactly what he wants. In the Joseph Smith translation, Pharaoh's making these decisions.
Got it. So what you're saying, the original, God hardened Pharaoh's heart.
That's right.
And in the translation, Pharaoh hardened his own heart.
That's correct.
So. That's
now,
awesome.
I've just made the argument that's anti-determinism, but maybe it's just that God has the perfect sense of probability we were talking about earlier, and he doesn't have to harden Pharaoh's heart because he knows Pharaoh's going to do it. This idea of the perfect sense of probability is something I came up as a teenager to explain how God could know everything and know the future and so forth, but also I could have freedom, and that I didn't realize that was deterministic at the time. I thought it was solving the problem.
Wait, so go deeper. So you're saying that if God allows freedom, but he also can see the future because we have prophecies and stuff, right? Your argument is that there's a probabilistic explanation for that.
Right. God has a perfect sense of probability, so he knows what I'm going to do. And on one level, that gives me my freedom back. On another level, we're still without freedom.
Yeah.
Because everything is already predetermined.
Right. And also doesn't square with my sense of God and his relationship to time.
No, I don't buy that anymore.
Yeah, good.
I don't like it anymore.
That didn't quite hold up with me. Okay, so that's very good. So you're saying that the translation ratifies this idea that we have free will. Okay.
Right. Yes. Okay. Or at least that's certainly a way to read it.
All right. The problem is that if you look at the biology, it becomes very hard to start to really understand what free will is. Right?
Yeah, and the more we learn about biology, the harder it gets.
That's right. So here I want to kind of diverge a bit.
Okay.
We're going to try and connect these topics near the end. Okay? Unless you had other places you want to go first.
No. If they fit in, they fit in. If they don't, they don't.
Okay. So, about 6 months ago, about a year ago, right? Sometime ago.
You're good at time, I can tell.
Okay. Recently,
Go on.
Recently, my wife and I went to go see a play called The Hard Problem. You heard of this
Also
one
by
before?
Tom Stoppard.
Also by Tom Stoppard.
I am only familiar with it by clicking on your link and skimming the Wikipedia page.
So it didn't get great reviews, as it turns out,
mm-hmm.
but based on the Wikipedia article. But when we saw it, I really liked it. So The Hard Problem is referring to the problem of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
All right, it's the problem of qualia, to use a philosophical term, right?
Okay.
Which refers to the ability for us to feel and experience things. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So the problem is, why do humans have a real sense of self? Right? Why do humans have this idea of experience, of having things that are happening to me right now? Right?
Mm-hmm.
So that is the problem of consciousness. And where does that derive? What organ expresses that? What part of the brain gives us consciousness? And in the play, there's a researcher who is who is investigating this and modifies some data, and it's interesting, and it doesn't go where you expect it would be, and it doesn't really also answer the question, which is good because nobody really knows what the answer is yet.
That is true. It is an open question.
It is very much an open question. So there's lots of theories, there's lots of philosophy about it. The Wikipedia article called Hard Problem of Consciousness is absolutely fascinating about this subject, right?
Yeah.
If you go and you read it, you'll read about things like philosophical zombies. All right?
Okay.
So the idea is that a philosophical zombie is someone who looks, acts, and responds exactly like a human would.
Yeah.
But they internally have no sense of self.
Blade Runner.
Right? A Blade Runner, right? There's no way for you to know when you talk to them that they have no sense of self, because they react as if they did. But inside they just don't.
This is high school philosophy, though. Like, man, I don't know, when I see red, you're seeing the same red.
That is true.
There's no way to know anybody else is real.
That's right. So,
and I'm not saying it isn't a useful scientific or philosophical question, but it is a tired question.
I think you are saying that.
I am saying that, but I think it can be both those things at the same time.
Okay, that's fine. Good. But the problem of consciousness directly relates to the problem of agency and of free will, right?
Sure. Yeah, you bet it does.
So, is this sense of agency really derived from the biology of the brain? Or is this something that comes from spirit?
Well, since you brought in philosophers and already pushed us away from biology, I'm going to bring in another philosopher, Joseph Campbell, the 20th century scholar on mythology. And he says that he talks about a plant that grew around a coconut tree at his house in Hawaii. And the plant reaches out its tendrils and grabs onto the coconut tree. It puts out really large leaves and points them towards the sun. And he says all those things are consciousness. Like, the plant is making the decision to face the sun. Like, it has a certain amount of will in order to do that. And he says the same thing's true in our body, right? When you eat, the example he gives is when you eat something, the body knows to produce bile and how much in order to deal with it.
Unless you've had your gallbladder removed.
That's right. Then avoid fatty foods. To get gross for a minute, your rectum, your anus, that part is very smart. How does it know? How does this thing which we would generally say it doesn't have consciousness because it's not our brain doing this.
That's right.
How can it tell the difference between a gas and a liquid and a solid, which it has to deal with all three of those things, and it has to let you know which is which.
This is a great analogy.
You could have it's not an analogy, man. This is life. And so yeah, there is the consciousness in our brain is seems to be of a higher order, certainly, than what our behind or a plant is doing.
Right.
But he would argue it's just a matter of degrees. All that is consciousness.
So it's interesting you say that. The matter of degrees is, you could, based on my remembering of these articles, is a reductionist approach, right? So the idea is that if you build up enough neurological circuits, you will eventually arrive
that is a
at
popular
consciousness.
Which is an argument in AI right now, right?
Yeah.
If you build enough faux neurotransmitters, do you eventually get an intelligence?
Right. It's such an interesting question. Have you heard of the are we living in a simulation argument?
Sure.
Okay. So here's, just briefly, here's how the argument goes. Okay.
Let's have it.
Okay, because the conclusion of the argument is striking. The conclusion is, yes, we're living in a simulation. And it's, yes, we're living in a simulation with 99.9 bar odds.
Just because... Well, I think I know this argument, but go ahead.
Okay, so here are the steps to the the argument. First step, it is possible to simulate consciousness.
Okay, well, that is, I don't know that that's an argument, but I have to accept that or nothing else works.
Right.
So
more like premises.
Right.
Premises.
Yes, a premise. Yeah.
Problems. You have to have the following three things.
Okay. Given that it is possible to make how did you phrase it?
Simulate
consciousness.
So what does that require? It means that, and I'm quoting from a podcast here called Infinite Monkey Cage. And this is the episode.
That's a great title.
Yes. Are we living in a simulation? We're going to have links to that. Also, they have another great episode, The Mind versus the Brain. So these two podcast episodes are really worth listening to as they talk about this, right? So is the mind substrate independent? All right?
I think I want you to define that for me.
Okay. In other words, is it possible to replicate it on a computer chip?
Okay.
Right now we have these neurons, right? And they build up into something of complexity high enough that it forms consciousness, right? A religious argument would say, but there's also a spirit, and that gets you the rest of the way there.
Sure.
Okay?
Although that's also lazy.
It's also lazy, right?
Go ahead.
And also may not even be true with religion.
Right. I'm really leery of any religious argument that says, and this bit of science we don't understand is explained by God.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think that's a way to build faith.
So let's set that aside for a second.
I think we've talked about that in the past anyway.
Exactly. So build it up. Okay, great. So the substrate independent means it's possible to replicate it on a different one.
Right.
And it doesn't matter how many resources you need to do it. Right? If it would require an entire planet's worth of computers to do it, that's fine. There's lots of planets. The civilization would have to get big enough to do it, be able to actually to do all this work. But let's assume that it could be done. Okay. That's step one. Step two, somebody has to want to. All right?
Okay.
Which is more complicated than you might think it is. Right? It is a lot of resources to build that simulation, right?
Yes.
And maybe by the time you get to be technologically advanced, nobody really cares anymore, and they have other stuff to work on, right?
Maybe.
So if you have those two things...
We go to the moon.
Right, exactly.
Do these other things.
It is a very human thing to do.
But because it is hard.
Yeah, right, exactly. So the third, it's not really a requirement, but it's a statement. Once you have these two things, it's possible to simulate, and somebody wants to, then you can now run that simulation as many times as you want.
Right.
And if you've done that, the number of times you can run that simulation versus how many lifetime experiences I've had.
Yes.
That ratio is incredibly large.
Right.
Therefore,
assuming it's possible and somebody wants to do it, then the amount of times it could be run is
so far and beyond.
Much closer to infinity than one lifetime.
Exactly. And so therefore, if those two assumptions are true, I'm living in a simulation. You're living in a simulation. Yeah. And what's interesting about living in a simulation, there's two arguments that are really interesting. The first is it means that there is a possibility of an afterlife, right?
Why?
Because that you could just turn it off and turn it back on again, reboot that character.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Gotcha.
Or move them into some of this. You can simulate whatever you want.
If you want to call that afterlife. But my first published short story actually was about that sort of afterlife.
Oh, we should put a link to it in
I'll
the
send
quotes.
you a link. It's my first published short story, so I'm not like asking for a Pulitzer or anything else, but it's related, so
So that's the first one. The second thing that's interesting about that is if it's true, then 100% of the resources of our civilization should be to make contact with the simulators and ask them not to turn it off.
Okay. This is the war games theory of reality.
Right. So it's interesting. The thing about if it's possible to simulation, that would mean that it's to simulate. It means it would all the feelings and experiences we have, including the spiritual ones, would therefore be simulated. Right?
Yeah.
The problem with this argument is that I can't see any way out of it. Right? To me, it's rock solid.
Yeah, it's rock solid if you accept a bunch of unprovable premises.
Sure. Exactly.
Yeah.
It is that.
I mean, this is really just the techno-erotic version of that high school theory that we were talking about before.
Yeah.
It's just made fancy with big words and science.
That's right.
But it's the same. Fancy. It's the same thing.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So
it's just MIT worthy.
The only thing that I can think of is just hope that it's not true, because I prefer the reality
to be real.
That I have. I prefer to be real. Right?
Can I tell you a story?
Go ahead.
So this story comes from a comic book collection I recently purchased on Kickstarter called All We Ever Wanted. The book as a whole is not that great, but it has a few really good stories. And I want to tell you about one called Good Time, written by Vasilis Pozios, perhaps, and pictures by Zach Som, perhaps.
Read by Eric Jepson.
Yes. And so here's the idea of... I'm going to ruin the whole thing. So, spoiler alert.
Spoilers.
It affects very few people because nobody buys comics anthologies on my recommendation, or the world would be a different place. I have a lot of evidence that nobody buys comics anthologies on my recommendation. But the story is about a guy who committed a murder and goes to jail for the rest of his life. Like his daughter grows up and he doesn't get to see her. His wife grows away from him. He gets in fights. He gets yard tattoos, and he gets beat up. He gets one time the picture of his daughter that he's held on for 30 years gets destroyed, and so on. And sad,
Grim.
Right? It's awful. And by the end, he's really come around. Like, he's really repentant of of his crime, and he's really feeling the weight of his punishment. And then it's been a simulation. They just ran him through a half-hour simulation that felt like the rest of his life. And so his punishment was, according to the courts, was to live his punishment. He did, literally, he has the memories of all those decades in prison, but he leaves the simulation, and his wife still loves him, and his daughter is still a toddler, and he gets to have the benefit of the simulation, but apply it to his real life.
There's a real reincarnation vibe about this.
Sure. Yeah, there is. And it's a fair point. On the one hand, yeah, please don't turn the simulation off, and I'd rather be living my own life. On the other hand, hey, it's a lot of stress to have one life.
It is.
And you just screw it up.
It is really easy to screw
Why not
things
embrace
up.
this?
It's very interesting. One of the things we talk about in our church is eternal progression, right?
We do talk about that.
What we don't talk about is how you get from here to there, right? We really focus on these 0 to 99 years of life, right? Because that's what we can see right now. We don't talk about how long it takes to actually finish the job.
And it's controversial, even among apostles, right? Is God still progressing, or is that heresy? You can find apostles on both sides of that question. And it's an interesting and I would argue important, maybe impossible to know, but important, worth thinking about question.
Is eternal progression, does it mean actually improving, like learning bowling and all that kind of thing? Or does it mean a family that grows forever?
That depends on who you ask and how they define it. So I don't have an answer for that, but I think it's a good question.
So I believe that we're not living in a simulation, because if we are in a simulation, then I feel like I don't have agency. And what's the point, right? The nihilist in me strikes out and says, what's the point?
Yeah, it's kind of like Pascal's wager, where he doesn't know if there's a God. but
Walk us through Pascal's wager for people who don't know about it.
Okay, I'm not looking at Wikipedia, so if I remember this wrong, please tell Aaron he should have made me fact check myself.
Problem.
But the basic idea is Pascal. Is there a God, Pascal? Pascal says, I don't know. I'm really not sure. I can't tell one way or another. But the benefits to believing in God are much greater than whatever benefits I get by not believing in God. And the risk of not believing in God is much worse than any risks associated with, And so it just makes sense. It's the wise decision to act as if God exists. And the same thing's true of agency. It is much better, and the world is a better place if everyone acts as if there's agency. But whether it's a simulation or not, whether we're real or not, it behooves us to act as if we are. So we're going to turn this into a Q&A. I'm going to ask you some questions about what I've written down.
Okay.
Actually, you already kind of covered this. I was going to say, does this mean if there's determinism? Let's leave the simulations out of here for a second.
Okay.
But if there is determinism, does that mean multiple universes therefore are thrown out of science? Can you have both determinism and multiple universes if everything is always exactly the same and there's never forks in the road?
The problem I've always considered the multiple universe hypothesis, unless there's some way to cross between the universes.
Yes.
A very useless construct.
So similar to the simulation, there's no point in believing in it.
Yeah, because yes, it's interesting to think of the physics, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting to try to prove it mathematically, right? And to consider what effect it has on our universe. But a consequence of the multiple universe theory, right, is that right now I'm choosing not to kill everyone in the room. Right?
Yes.
So there would be a universe where suddenly I snap and just destroy the world, right? I've never.
Well, that's
never
more
bought
like
it.
infinite universes rather than simply multiple. But it's a hard line to draw. Like,
Yeah.
if this is the kind of thinking that Douglas Adams makes fun of in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where if the universe is truly infinite, then everything is happening at all times somewhere, and so.
Rick and Morty solves this problem.
Oh, how did they? Well, let's.
They don't really solve it, but what they talk about instead of infinite universes is like they talk about local manifolds, right? Local curves in space where they're kind of interacting.
Okay.
In space-time. They only cover it very briefly. They just mention that phrase. And thinking about it, that's kind of what I thought that they were referring to, is that there may be infinite universes, but they only have access to. Rick and Morty is great. I cannot recommend it, right? Because it is...
My wife won't watch it to me entirely because
it's
Is it Rick or Morty who's the older fellow?
Rick.
Rick makes a lot of terrible, awful, disgusting noises with his mouth.
Yes, he does.
So she won't watch it with me. I own the first season. I've only seen
it's also very violent and rude, and it's a very MA kind of show. But it is the best science fiction that is being made right now.
The idea of reincarnation is an interesting one from a Mormon perspective. The idea of and how it connects to eternal progression. My brother, I don't know if he still does, but there was a time when my brother believed in reincarnation, and I have met other Mormons who believe in reincarnation. I don't. I mean,
our scriptures seem pretty
clear
about
but
this.
Reincarnation does solve some problems. It creates new problems also, but it does solve some problems. I mean, this comes back to our red ball conversation. If God is infinitely good, then why is there this system where you only get one chance? And that's where, can you repent in the afterlife? Well, not if you had a reasonable chance. Well, what constitutes a reasonable chance? This is a nighttime argument that can go on forever with Latter-day Saints. Is what does it mean to have enough of a chance to make?
I mean, we have these scriptures that say things like it is too late for this one group of people. Right?
They do, but don't forget that those same scriptures have Jesus saying, oh, yeah, eternal fire... That doesn't mean you're there forever. It just means, my name's eternal, and it's my fire, so it's eternal fire, and it freaks people out, so we call it eternal fire.
Yeah.
That's also Mormon scripture.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite scriptures, too.
I love it, too. But it does throw a lot of other things under the question when you realize, oh, wait. Is he messing with us right now to make a point? And once we're a little bit wiser, we'll realize that he's... It's an interesting theological problem, but I like my God that way. I want to pitch one more science fiction story.
Okay, good.
This is by Ted Chiang. It's very short. It's called What's Expected of Us. It was published in, I forget which one, but it was published in Nature. I knew it was one of the big ones.
Wow.
Science fiction published in Nature, which happens every once in a while, right?
That's awesome.
So it's a science fiction story, very short, published in Nature. You may know him.
Nature, one of the big three scientific publications.
Yeah.
Science, Cell, Nature.
Yeah, and I think Cell's number 3.
Yeah, oh yeah, definitely. Sorry, Cell.
So it's one of the big two. So anyway, so it's published in Nature. That's a fun fact. It's not important. But you probably know Ted Chiang. He is the one whose story is the basis of the movie Arrival.
Oh, what a great movie that is.
Which is a fabulous movie.
Yeah.
And his stories are so good. Like, I can't recommend him enough. Mm-hmm. He's fantastic. Buy his short story collection. This story is not in the collection. It's very short. In the version I made for when I copied it off the web and made it for my students, it's 2 pages, and as you can see, this is pretty big text. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to read the first 3 paragraphs, which might be too long, so I'll pause after the second one, and you can edit it if you feel like that's the right thing to do. This is a warning. Please read carefully. By now, you've probably seen a predictor. Millions of them have been sold by the time you're reading this. For those who haven't seen one, it's a small device, like a remote for opening your car door. Its only features are a button and a big green LED. The light flashes if you press the button. Specifically, the light flashes 1 second before you press the button. I'm going to stop there, actually. That's the end of the second paragraph. And you can't fool it. Mm-hmm. You can't fool it. You can say, I'm not going to push the button, and it won't go off. And once you say, I'm going to wait for the light and then not push the button, you can't. Like, it always is right. Always 1 second before you push the button, the light goes off. And, well, let me ask you, Aaron. I'll let you, literature is the laboratory for humanity.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, the predictor's everywhere. Both your kids have one. You have one sitting on your desk at work. It goes off 1 second every time before you push the button. Uh-huh. How does that change your life?
Wow, what a great short story. I'm going to have to read it now to figure out the answer. Doesn't it completely take away the concept of free will?
It certainly seems to.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty good evidence there's no such thing as free will.
Right. Oh, what a great idea.
So how do you react?
Well, first of all, it's science fiction, so I reject the premise.
Right.
But if I lived in that universe, I would be terrifying, right? Because now all of a sudden, I don't have free will any longer, right?
Right.
Because I think that's what that would mean. And it's interesting that I say that. I hadn't actually zeroed in on that feeling before. The idea of not having free will. The idea,
truly believing that.
Yeah, the idea of captivity. The neurobiologist's perspective of we are just a pile of synapses, and what will be determined by the gradients between synapses in our brains.
Yes.
Right? And we don't really have control. That thought is terrifying, right? It's I can't even wrap my head around it. It's such a scary thought.
Yeah.
Because it completely goes against, because it puts me in captivity, is what it does. It puts me in a box that I can't get out of, right? And I have these visions of being bricked up in an Edgar Allan Poe story by my own brain that I can't make choices. And so maybe it is a defense mechanism that I just reject that reality completely. Yeah. Right? Or what I would prefer to believe, and what I hope I believe, is that because we're having this conversation at all, it means that it's not true.
Yeah, I listened to a journalist on This American Life interview some scientists on this question who've all arrived at the conclusion that there's really no way around a lack of free will.
Yeah. Because it's really easy to arrive at that conclusion.
Right. It is easy, and it's very simple and logical, and it's clean. And science loves clean answers.
Yeah.
But ultimately, no matter how much you know it to be true, I think, like you were saying, I don't think our minds truly accept it. And even if they did, we would just what does it mean? Because to suggest that knowing you don't have free will would cripple you suggests there's free will. Mm-hmm. And I know that this is like a roundabout argument that proves both sides of the argument, and that's fine. But again, what's the point of believing you don't have free will?
I mean,
what's the value?
I have faith that I don't have free will, and I meaning that I have free will, right? It is a thing unseen that I believe, right?
That's what faith is
That
supposed
is what
to mean.
faith is.
As long as it's true.
Yeah, that is true. It is a thing unseen that is true. And so that's my faith.
Yeah.
I hope it's real.
An acquaintance of mine, D. Michael Martinsdale, double checking his name. Yeah, an acquaintance of mine, D. Michael Martinsdale, who's an LDS writer. He had this great expression, this great definition of art, which I really love. And it's a very Latter-day Saint definition of art. But art is something about which perfect beings can disagree, which is great because
that's a great definition.
If we become gods, then we all know physics equally well, right? Yeah. And we all have that perfect sense of probability we were talking about before. But art is something that exists outside that. It's not right or wrong. It's something perfect people could disagree about. And I think that one of the reasons I love that formulation is because it implies no matter how far eternal progression takes us, we still have agency. We still have free will. It can be an eternal principle as long as there's art in the world.